On Christmas Eve of 1945 in West Virginia, George and Jenny Sodder had been celebrating the Christmas season with 9 of their 10 children. Their son Joe was still away in the Army. As it got late, George went to bed, followed shortly by his sons, John, 23 years old, and George Jr., 16. When Jenny decided it was time for the rest of the children to go to sleep, they had pleaded with her to stay up and play with some of their toys their older sister, Marianne, 17, had gotten for them. Jenny agreed and then took her youngest child, Sylvia, 3, to bed with her. A little past midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered it and a woman asked to speak to someone Jenny didn't know. When Jenny told her she had the wrong number, the woman laughed hysterically and then hung up. Jenny, thinking this was a prank call, hung up too, not thinking much of it. She then noticed that the lights were still on in the house and the doors were unlocked. She found this unusual because her kids were normally very good about attending to these things before bed. She turned off the lights, locked the doors, and went back to sleep. What happened next would become one of the most bizarre, unsolved mysteries in all of West Virginia. Jenny had barely fallen back asleep when she heard a thump on the roof followed by the sound of something rolling. She realized the house was on fire around 1:30 a.m. She screamed for her husband and children to run out of the house. The oldest boys, John and George Jr., made it out of the house as well as the oldest girl, Marianne, who ran out with baby Sylvia. When George was outside and saw that 5 of his children were still inside, he tried everything possible to re-enter the home and save them. He first broke a window and in doing that cut his arm. Through all the smoke, he saw that flames covered the entire first floor. He then ran into a rain barrel to get buckets of water to try to extinguish the fire, but to his dismay, found the water to be frozen solid in the cold winter. Thinking quickly, he ran to where he always kept his ladder, but it had mysteriously vanished. He attempted and failed to climb the house by hand. In one last attempt, he and his sons thought to pull their work trucks up to the house to climb on them to get inside the top floor. Their terrible luck continued when they found that the trucks would not start due to the cold weather. In the meantime, Marianne had to run to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. At first, the operator could not be reached to place the call, and when finally they did reach the operator, each of the town's firemen had to be called, woken up, and then dispatched to the scene. The fire station was less than 3 miles from the Sodder home, but the firemen didn't get there until 8 a.m. Unfortunately, this was far too late as the house burned to the ground in less than 45 minutes of the fire starting. The police arrived on the scene in the morning and after only a 2-hour investigation concluded that the fire was started by faulty wiring. George insisted that couldn't be the case because he had just gotten the wiring redone not too long ago, and plus, the lights had stayed on for a time after the fire had started. The reports at the time claimed that there had been no remains whatsoever found in the ashen rubble. No bones, no scraps of clothing, nothing. However, it was ruled by the coroner's jury that the 5 missing Sodder children had died in the fire. A few days after the fire, George Sodder plowed over what was left of his home and planted flowers there in memory of his children, although the fire marshal advised against doing so. Despite the floral memorial, George and Jenny believed that their children had been kidnapped and that the fire was intentionally set to cover the crime scene, and there were witnesses and rumors that supported that belief. A strange man was witnessed stealing from the Sodders' garage as the fire was burning. He had stolen their ladder and attempted to cut their power line, but instead cut the phone line. The ladder was later found away from the house and down in an embankment. For some reason unknown, this man was never looked closely at as a suspect. He was only ordered to pay fines for stealing. Another witness, a bus driver, noticed a strange man throwing fireballs at the house before the fire started. This claim was further backed up the following spring when little Sylvia found a green shell in the yard. The Sodders showed the object to a friend in the military who believed it to be an explosive device similar to a napalm bomb. There was also a woman who claimed to have seen the children in a passing car when the fire was in progress. A woman at a tourist stop 50 miles west of the Sodder home says she saw the kids the morning after the fire and served them breakfast. They then left in a vehicle with Florida license plates. Yet another woman said she saw 4 of the 5 missing children at her hotel in Charleston, South Carolina. She said that they were with 2 men and 2 women and that she tried to speak to the children, but the adults looked hostile and wouldn't allow it. They then spoke to the kids in Italian. According to her, they checked in near midnight, but the exact date she couldn't remember. They left early the next morning. Most people believe that her story was not reliable enough for further investigation. Meanwhile, Jenny decided to try to do her own research by using chicken bones in the stove, and she could never get them to be completely destroyed by fire. Her and George's belief was strengthened more when another local home was burned to the ground and 7 skeletons were found in the debris. With all of these possible leads, the Sodders went to the authorities to have their case reopened, but the police refused because they believed no crime had taken place. In 1949, George, with the help of others, dug up in the site of his former home looking for any remains that may have been overlooked. Reports claimed that pieces of bone and possible human organs had been found. However, the organ found was tested in a lab and found to be relatively fresh beef liver. Some say that it was planted there in an attempt to cover up shoddy police work. It was also reported that 4 pieces of vertebrae and 2 small bones, possibly belonging to a child's hand, had been found. A medical expert involved in the case stated that it would be very unlikely for all the other remains to be destroyed in such a quick burning fire. This expert believed the remains came from a 14 to 15-year-old child, but George did not believe these bones belonged to his son because of the location they were found. Years later, after more testing on the bones, another expert stated that the remains belonged to a person between 16 to 22 years of age and that the bones showed absolutely no signs of being damaged in a fire. It is thought that the bones were placed there from a nearby graveyard as a cover-up, but there is nothing that supports this theory. 6 years after the tragedy, the Sodders made one last attempt to find new leads on their case. They put a billboard at the site of the fire with the pictures of all 5 of their missing children, along with the story of what happened that night. They even offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who could find their children. Without any luck, they raised the reward to $10,000, but still no one came forward with clues or information. In 1968, a detective wrote an article about the events that took place that Christmas Eve years ago. A few months after the article was published, the Sodders received a photo in the mail that was claiming to be one of their sons, Louis, as an adult. A message on the back of the photograph read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, A90132. Most people thought this was just a cruel hoax brought on by the article, but the Sodders thought it was a sign their children were still alive. George and Jenny hired a private investigator who left for Kentucky to follow leads on the photo. Shortly after leaving, the private investigator vanished and was never heard from again. The person in the photo is still a mystery, as well as the person who sent the photo. Those who have studied the case point out that George owned a coal trucking business. At the time, this industry was under a lot of pressure from the mafia, so some thought the gang was involved with the disappearance of the children. Furthermore, the number 90132 that was on the back of the photo was at that time the postal code for Palermo, Sicily. George Sodder died in 1969 and Jenny in 1989. The majority of people believe that the Sodder children perished in the fire that night, and the Sodders just refused to accept it. There are also those who believe the kids were kidnapped and taken to Italy. The youngest Sodder child, Sylvia, who's only an infant at the time, is still trying to figure out what happened to her siblings that horrible night.